For today's history video, I'd like to talk about the approach to World War II, how we got into it and what went on during the period around 1938 to 1941. In the last few videos, I've discussed the other aspects of the Roosevelt administration. We've had 4 videos about them and one on the Hoover administration before that. They're archived on the site, and you can look at it for a revisionist history of the New Deal. It basically didn't work. But as the 1930s wore on, it became evident that Hitler was trying to expand all over the world, so was Japan, and that we would ultimately have to get into the war. There was fierce opposition from the American people to entering the war. We call it isolationism, but what it really was a right-wing feeling of what has the rest of the world got to do with us, and a left-wing feeling that we had been duped into getting into World War I by the armaments industry. Senator Joseph Nye, I believe of Nebraska, held extensive hearings about war profiteering and the subsidization of pro-war propaganda by armaments companies, and it fueled a global desire for disarmament and a global distrust of any intervention in World War. And they were right. World War I was a complete waste of time, and the United States should never have gotten involved in it. But World War II was an entirely different story, but people weren't making that kind of a distinction. Roosevelt knew that we had to get into World War II, and he had a secret plan to enable us to do it, to force us to do it. When Japan invaded Manchuria, in retaliation, Roosevelt set up an oil embargo against Japan in 1939. And that embargo was really like Saudi Arabia embargoing oil to the United States in 1973, and it screwed up our economy for almost a decade. And that's really what the United States did to Japan. Back then, we were the supplier of 50, 60, 70% of the world's oil and all of Japan's oil. And the Japanese Navy, which ran on oil, understood that it could not expand throughout Asia, as was its goal, as long as America was cutting off oil shipments. So they had to get oil from somewhere. The nearest oil they could get was in the Gulf, with South China Sea, with Indonesia and the Philippines. And they had to get into past Java, Borneo, into that area to be able to get the gold. And to do that, they had to go through China. They had to take Britain on in conquering Hong Kong and Singapore. And they knew damn well that if they went to war with Britain, a war with the United States would inevitably follow. So they struck at Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt didn't know they were going to strike Pearl Harbor, but he knew darn well that the policy he was setting in place would force Japan to attack the United States. He thought it would be in the Philippines. In the meantime, the question of giving aid to Britain, especially after the fall of France, came to dominate the political debate in the United States. And Roosevelt carefully pushed intervention, one step at a time. He said we need to be prepared. We're not going into war, but we need to be prepared, and we need a draft. We know the draft passed by 1 vote in the House. That's how averse people were to everything. And when he tried to give Britain some destroyers, which they could use to protect their transatlantic shipment, he dressed it up as a destroyers for bases deal, where Britain gave us some very valuable naval bases we still have today in return for these destroyers. It was ultimately a good deal for the U.S. and a bad one for Britain, but Roosevelt insisted on it because he needed to be able to give an excuse to give the destroyers to Britain. But the real problem Roosevelt had was that Britain was running out of money to buy armaments, and American law was cash and carry. You pay cash and you carry the armaments away in your own boats. And Britain was running out of ships and running out of cash. So Roosevelt proposed the Lendlease program, where we would basically give them the weapons. The facade was we would lend it to them, and at the end of the war they would pay us back. Roosevelt had a cute metaphor. He said, if your neighbor's house is on fire, he doesn't want your money, he wants to borrow your hose. And when the fire's extinguished, he'll give you back your hose. And that was the Lend-Lease program. We, of course, never got the bullets and tanks back. But the problem was, how do you get it passed? And the presidential election of 1940 was shaping up to be an election in which the anti-intervention forces, the isolationists, would win. The leading candidate for the Republican nomination was Senator Vandenberg, who was an avowed isolationist, and Robert Taft was involved, and it looked like they would have a Republican Party committed to staying out of the war. Then the Brits got a hold of this, and Britain subsidized a massive campaign throughout the United States to defeat Taft and Vandenberg and Dewey, the other guy, Republican, and nominate a guy named Wendell Willkie instead for president. Willkie was a harmless utility executive from Indiana, but was pro-intervention. He was internationalist. And all of the British propaganda outlets got together and funded this movement for Dewey. And the Herald Tribune, which was always internationalist and liberal, was bought off and became really the center of advocacy for change in the Republican Party. And it was the most incredible thing, without anyone understanding what was going on, with Time and Life and the magazines Look and the Herald Tribune and the New York Times, the whole establishment pushing for Willkie and against the traditional Republican candidates. They succeeded in upending the Republican Party in the primaries and nominating Willkie on an internationalist platform. It was just an incredible coup, fascinating, well worth reading. Willkie lost the election to FDR, which was fine. Roosevelt pretended he didn't want to run for a third term, but had to be drafted into running because of the war, and he was like a soldier doing his duty. But with Willkie running, it was clear that either way, we were on course to getting involved in World War II. Thanks for watching.